According to the National Association of Elected and Appointed Officials, it's projected that an estimated 13 million Hispanics will vote nationwide this November. In a new survey released this week, Miami-based pollsters Ben Dixon and Amandi International teamed up with the Terrence Group for a poll on Hispanic voters for Univision to see what this essential demographic thinks of the issues and the candidates. Joining me now for an analysis, we welcome Anthony Williams, Special Projects Director at Ben Dixon and Amandi International. Anthony, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we have a lot to unpack in this poll that you all worked in Florida as well as 3 southwestern states, and we'll get into that. Let me just say that your sample in this poll was 400 Hispanic registered voters in Florida. It was given in both English and Spanish, and so with that sample size, which is appropriate for the Hispanic population in Florida, we have a margin of error of 4.9, or about 5%.
Exactly.
Okay, so, and with that, what did we find in the presidential horse race?
Well, what we found is that, I guess not surprisingly, given the context of the race thus far, Secretary Clinton holds a pretty substantial lead over Donald Trump at the moment. However, the other thing that we thought was interesting is we always try to provide context for what election results mean. And when you look at the final vote total in the 2012 election between President Obama and Mitt Romney, you find that really both candidates are currently running behind their predecessors. Hillary Clinton is about 9 points behind what President Obama ultimately got, and Donald Trump is about 10 points behind what Mitt Romney ultimately got. So both campaigns really have some work to do in closing the deal with the Hispanic vote in Florida.
Right. Let's see, we can take a look at those numbers of what we have in, if the election was held today, Hillary Clinton would win the Hispanic vote in Florida with 53%, according to the survey. Donald Trump has 29%. The Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson, 6%, and the Green Party candidate Jill Stein, 2%. So you're saying that the front runners, or the 2 main candidates, Clinton and Trump, are both running behind their predecessors in 2012. Why is that? Your colleague, Fernanda Mondi, said that she's not only not where Obama is, but she should be beating those numbers right now. What's the problem with?
You would think, given the image that Mr. Trump has among Hispanics, both in Florida and nationally, that she would be doing better. I think there are 2 things that are holding that back. First, obviously, is the impact of the other party candidates. In 2012, there really was not a significant third-party candidacy by anybody, where in this case you have 2 people who are both a drag on Hillary and on Donald. So both campaigns are losing a few points to those other candidates. You also still have about a 10% other undecided category. We can get into a little bit later on. One of the issues that continues to dog Secretary Clinton, at least, is a bit of a lack of trust, which is really the only significant weak spot she has among Hispanic voters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on that point, indeed, the poll found that about 46% of poll respondents considered Secretary Clinton to be a liar. And the question was not asked the same way about Donald Trump. I think the equivalent question about Donald Trump was, do you believe him when he says that he regrets something he said in the past, and he may temper his language moving forward? Right. So they didn't ask that specific question, but they found that, again, 46% found Hillary Clinton to be, they would describe her as a liar. However, still they find Hillary Clinton to be more honest and trustworthy than Trump by 41 to 27% advantage. What does that tell us?
Well, that context, I think, tells you all you need to know about why people are preferring Clinton over Trump. The fact that most, well, not most, but almost half consider her to be untrustworthy, but still consider her to be more trustworthy than the alternative, gives you a pretty clear indication as to why she's getting the majority of the vote. But it also explains why she's lagging behind where President Obama was. Over the closing 6 weeks of the campaign, that's an issue that she's going to have to address in order to get the vote margin that she's going to need among Hispanics in order to pull out Florida.
Right. So if we were to look, again, some specific questions here of which candidate inspires greater confidence in improving the lives of Hispanics, you can see there that 56% said Hillary Clinton, 26% Trump, 5% Johnson, and 1% Stein. Do we know anything about what the voters may think about the candidates and what they may do for the quote-unquote Hispanic community?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that Secretary Clinton has, decades of relationship with the Hispanic community, so there's a certain level of belief that her policies would be positive for that community. We also asked a battery of questions on a whole host of specific issues, everything from the economy to terrorism to who has a better temperament to serve in the office, and she scores higher than he does on all of those metrics. So, when you take the sum total of that, she's considered to be the better choice for Hispanics, which is what's being reflected currently in the horse race question.
So if you were in the Clinton campaign, would you, if you were advising or giving them advice on this, based on these poll results, would you say that they're where they should be with Hispanic voters? They're doing all right?
I would say that they're doing well, but they have work to do. Our polling, not only in Florida but in other states, suggests that she's likely to receive 6 or 7 out of every 10 Hispanic votes cast. Mm-hmm. But if there is not significant outreach to turn those voters out, then she's leaving votes on the table.
And how about Donald Trump? What can he do to improve his numbers with Hispanics?
Well, Donald Trump's biggest issue has been twofold. Number one, his entire campaign, early candidacy, was based on the immigration issue. And what we find is that, among voters, the immigration issue is not a personal issue because they're citizens. So, we're not talking about a pathway to citizenship for them. Mm-hmm. However, they see the immigration issue as a prism through which to judge a candidate and how they see the Hispanic community. It's particularly sensitive in the southwest of the United States, where most of the voters are Mexican American, and virtually all of them have a friend, a family member, a coworker who is undocumented. And so there's a greater sensitivity to that issue. What we found surprising in this election season is that even here in Florida, the importance of the immigration issue has risen, which is surprising when you consider the majority of Hispanics in Florida are either Cuban, and there's the Cuban Adjustment Act, or Puerto Rican, and they're already citizens. So immigration is not really an issue for these voters, and yet they're more sensitive to it than they have ever been before.
Right. Well, let's look at this on the screen here. Which of the following issues will be the most important in deciding your vote in November? And so no surprise that the jobs and economy issue is at the top. Quarter of the voters in Florida and Arizona, and slightly more in Colorado and Nevada, point to that as their top issue. But as you were talking about, Anthony, the immigration issue, 12% of Floridians in the poll found that to be most significant, 18% in Arizona, 14 in Colorado, 19 in Nevada. And we have education there, which is slightly behind immigration. Does it surprise you that education doesn't register more with Hispanic voters?
Well, historically, education is usually one of the top 2 or 3 issues. Jobs and the economy is almost always first.
Number one.
Education usually is second or third. In years past, healthcare was much higher on the list, but since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, we've seen that go down. What was surprising was for immigration to come up. It's usually 4th or 5th on this list, and now it's pretty much second across the board.
And you think that a lot of that has to do with Donald Trump and his rhetoric?
I think that's entirely due to Donald Trump and his rhetoric. Again, these voters are not reacting to a personal fear. They're already citizens, but they are sensitive to the issue because they have friends, family members, coworkers who may be impacted.
Mm-hmm. One of the most striking things for me in these poll results was that 59% of the Hispanic people polled could not identify Tim Kaine, Clinton's running mate, and 60% didn't recognize Mike Pence, Trump's running mate. What does that tell us?
Well, early on in these campaigns, that's not unusual. Most vice presidential nominees are relatively unknown outside of their home states. They're usually senators or governors who are very well known and well regarded in political circles, but among voters at large around the country, not very well known. What I think is going to be interesting over the closing weeks of the campaign is how the 2 campaigns choose to deploy their vice presidential nominees to outreach to voters in general, and in particular to Hispanic voters. I think in that regard, Tim Kaine has the potential to bring a little bit more to the table than Mike Pence, simply by virtue of the fact that he's fluent in Spanish, and as a result could take advantage of media opportunities where he'll be able to speak directly to voters in language.
Right. We're under a minute now. You all looked at the Senate race between Marco Rubio and Patrick Murphy. We'll have to get into that another time. But I wanted to quickly talk about Amendment 4, the medical marijuana initiative that's on the ballot. According to your numbers, that looks like it could pass above 60%. It has higher Hispanic approval than 2 years ago.
Yeah, and we think that that could be the critical swing vote that puts that measure over the top. 4 years ago, Hispanic voters were largely against the measure, led primarily by older Cuban voters here in South Florida. And now that we see over 60% of Hispanic voters being in favor of the measure, it's more likely that it'll pass overall.
Okay, all good stuff. Thank you very much, Anthony
My pleasure.
Williams, for joining us today on Issues. I'm Sean Foreman. Thanks for watching. To see what this essential demographic thinks of the issues and the candidates. Joining me now for an analysis, we welcome Anthony Williams, Special Projects Director at Bendixson and Amandi International. Anthony, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we have a lot to unpack in this poll that you all worked in Florida, as well as 3 South the presidential horse race.
Well, what we found is that, I guess not surprisingly, given the context of the race thus far, Secretary Clinton holds a pretty substantial lead over Donald Trump at the moment. However, the other thing that we thought was interesting is we always try to provide context for what election results mean. And when you look at the final vote total in the 2012 election between President Obama and Mitt Romney, you find that really both candidates are currently running behind their predecessors. Hillary Clinton is about 9 points behind what President Obama ultimately got, and Donald Trump is about 10 points behind what Mitt Romney ultimately got. So both campaigns really have some work to do in closing the deal with the Hispanic vote in Florida.
Western states, and we'll get into that. Let me just say that your sample in this poll was 400 Hispanic registered voters in Florida. It was given in both English and Spanish, and so with that sample size, which is appropriate for the Hispanic population in Florida, we have a margin of error of 4.9, or about 5%.
Exactly.
Okay, so, and with that, what did we find? According to the National Association of Elected and Appointed Officials, it's projected that an estimated 13 million Hispanics will vote nationwide this November. In a new survey released this week, Miami-based pollsters Bendixson and Amandi International teamed up with the Terrence Group for a poll on Hispanic voters for Univision.